Day 365. 1 year ago, my job was to preserve the past. Now, my only job is to have a future. They don't tell you in Archivist school how to catalog the end of the world or how to fight what comes after. Day 365. 1 year. The dust never really settles, it just moves. It coats every surface in a fine gray powder, a cremated remnant of a world that was. Every morning I wipe it from the cover of this journal, and every evening it has returned. It's the finest of particles, composed of concrete, plaster, ash, and things I refuse to contemplate. It's the dust of history, I suppose. The great equalizer, the final anonymous sediment of a billion lives. It gets into everything, finding its way past seals and into climate-controlled rooms, a constant, gritty reminder of the decay. A year ago, I wore white cotton gloves to handle 15th-century manuscripts, my breath held lest a stray particle of moisture tarnish the vellum. My greatest fear was the slow, inexorable decay of cellulose, thick, a subtle foxing on a forgotten map, the chemical burn of acid on old paper. Today, I used a page from the Kennicott Bible, a priceless illuminated text from 1476, a masterpiece of Sephardic art that had survived the Spanish Inquisition and 2 world wars, to light a fire for warmth. The page I chose depicted the Garden of Eden, a tragic, beautiful irony. I needed to boil water scavenged from a rainwater cistern, and the kindling was damp. For a moment, under the flick of my lighter, the gold leaf shimmered, a flash of defiance against the encroaching dark. Adam and Eve looked out with painted, innocent eyes as the flames curled the vellum into black ash. The things you do to survive the cold. It was a choice between a piece of the past and a chance at a future. A year ago, that choice would have been unthinkable, a sacrilege that would have ended my career and haunted my conscience. Today, it was just Tuesday. My name is Arthur Calloway, and I was, for 27 years, the senior archivist. Archivist at the National Central Archive. My job was to preserve the memory of our civilization, to be the custodian of its story. I never imagined my final job would be to write its obituary, one day at a time, in a cheap ledger I found in the accounting office. This was the first year of the end of the world, and this is how I, an archivist, survived it. It started not with a bang, but with a whisper, buried deep in the digital noise of the 24-hour news cycle. A news report about a rabbit flu in a distant port city, relegated to the 3rd story after a politician scandal and a celebrity divorce. I remember it clearly because I was in the middle of authenticating a series of letters from the Second World War, the paper so brittle it threatened to turn to dust in my hands. The news was just background chatter, the hum of distant tragedy we'd all grown accustomed to. Then another report, this time from a major European capital. Then a dozen. The whispers became a chorus, then a scream that filled the airwaves until there was nothing else. We were at work in the quiet, climate-controlled heart of the archive when the final directive came through the emergency broadcast system. A shrill, 3-toned alarm sliced through the classical music playing on the radio, followed by a flat, synthetic voice. Shelter in place, immediately. This is not a drill. For me, that meant the archive, a 6-story fortress of granite and reinforced concrete, with its own climate control, its own deep well water filtration systems, and its own diesel backup generators designed to last a month. A veritable tomb, built to withstand fire, flood, and time itself. The building's chief engineer, a gruff man named Henderson, used to joke it could survive a direct nuclear strike. It turned out to be remarkably effective against the undead as well. The lockdown was an automated process, a relic of Cold War paranoia. One moment I was discussing the deacidification of a colonial-era map with my junior. Or colleague, the next a deafening klaxon blared and heavy steel shutters slammed down over the windows with the percussive force of a firing squad. 3-foot-thick blast doors began grinding shut, sealing the entrances with the finality of a sarcophagus. The city noise, the constant living hum, was cut off instantly. The world outside simply ceased to exist. In those first few days, the silence was the most terrifying thing. The ever-present hum of the city, the traffic, the sirens, the distant roar of life died. It was a slow, creeping death. First, the sirens stopped answering the calls. For an entire day, they just blared, a constant, overlapping scream from every corner of the city, a sound I can only describe as the city itself dying. Then, one by one, they went silent. Then the traffic thinned to nothing. Then, finally, on the evening of the second day, the power grid failed. The city plunged into a darkness so deep and absolute it felt like a physical weight. The archive's operators kicked in with a shuddering groan from 3 stories below, and I was left in a bubble of artificial light and humming machinery, surrounded by an ocean of suffocating silence. It was a profound quiet, broken only by the hushed whisper of the archival-grade ventilation system cycling the air, and the frantic, riotous pounding of my own heart. I tried to occupy myself with my work, with my knowledge. Not for survival, not yet, but for reassurance, for the comfort of familiar process in a world gone mad. I went to the architectural records vault. I pulled the original 1932 blueprints of the building, then the 1968 seismic retrofitting plans, then the 2011 digital security overhaul schematics. I cross-referenced them, my hands tracing the lines of forgotten maintenance tunnels, sealed-off sub-basements from the Cold War era, and the intricate labyrinth of the HVA system. I was building a 3-dimensional map in my mind, memorizing every security door, every manual override, ever. Yet, potential vulnerability. My colleagues, they didn't share my focus. There were 12 of us who were sealed inside. Dr. Evelyn Reed, head of antiquities, a woman whose arrogance was matched only by her brilliance, insisted it was all a hysterical overreaction. "This is a gross misuse of federal property, Arthur," she told me on day 2, her voice sharp and brittle. "My grant proposal is due Friday. I need access to my office computer, which is, I might add, on the city power grid." I tried to show her the satellite feeds from the security office, the images of chaos and violence erupting on the streets just beyond our walls. She waved a dismissive hand. "Media sensationalism, deep fakes. You can't trust anything you see on a screen anymore." On day 3, she tried to use her high-level keycard to override the main entrance lockdown. The security footage showed the outer doors opening and a wave of screaming, running people and the things chasing them, overwhelming her in an instant of bloody chaos. The door sealed again automatically. The system registered her keycard as terminated. We didn't watch the footage twice. Mark, a young intern, barely 20, was inconsolable. His family was across town. He spent 2 days curled in a corner of the staff lounge, staring at a dead phone. On day 4, driven by a grief and panic so potent it was almost a physical force, he grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall. "I have to get to them," he whispered, his eyes wide and unfocused. I stood in his way. "Mark, there's nothing out there. Listen, just listen to the silence. It's not safe." He just shook his head and pushed past me, heading for the 3rd-floor windows. A window made of reinforced tempered glass. It took him hours. The sound, the sharp, echoing crack of the breaking glass in the profound silence, was like a dinner bell for a starving city. I saw them from another window, on the street below, dozens of them, heads snapping up in unison, their shambling walk turning into a horrifying, jerky run toward the sound. He didn't even make it down the fire escape. The others left one by one, in pairs or alone, driven by hope or despair. Two of them, a married couple from the cataloging department named the Hendersons, believed a military extraction point was being set up at the city hall. They left with a small bag of supplies and a shared, terrified look of determination. I never saw them again. The others couldn't stand the quiet, the waiting, the feeling of being trapped. They chose the chaos over the tomb. By day 7, I was alone, the sole keeper of 1 billion silent stories, while a new, terrible one screamed and clawed and raged just outside my granite walls. The silence was no longer terrifying. It was a shield. It was the sound of my continued existence. Hunger is a powerful motivator. It can override fear, grief, and even the instinct for self-preservation. By day 10, the emergency rations in the staff kitchen, stale crackers, expired peaches, protein bars, and a few sad-looking cans of soup were gone. The vending machines had been emptied. The generators were still running, but the water purifiers required a maintenance cycle I didn't know how to perform, and the replace filter light was blinking an ominous red. Dehydration was becoming a real threat. My first trip outside was a calculated risk, born of desperation. Across the street, a food truck, Gus's Gourmet Dogs, was parked askew on the sidewalk, its cheerful cartoon hot dog logo a grotesque mockery of the New World. Through binoculars from the rooftop observation deck, it looked untouched, a small metal island in a sea of abandoned cars and debris. My plan was meticulous, an archivist's approach to survival. I spent a full day in the cartography section, studying high-resolution satellite maps of the immediate area and cross-referencing them with municipal utility charts. I mapped the movements of the dead from every north-facing window, noting their patterns, the causes, the effects. Air density at different times of day, their response to stimulus. They were listless, shambling, drawn to sound and movement but otherwise passive, caught in endless looping paths. I would exit through a sub-level maintenance hatch that opened into the alley behind the archive, a location I had identified from the 1932 blueprints, a relic of the building's coal delivery system. The 30-yard dash across the open street to the truck would be the most dangerous part. No amount of planning could prepare me for the sensory overload. After more than a week in the climate-controlled, filtered air environment of the archive, the outside world was an assault. The air was thick with the coppery stench of blood and decay, an odor so overpowering it made my eyes water and my stomach clench. The silence I had grown accustomed to was replaced by a low, constant moaning, a death rattle from the city itself, punctuated by the incessant, hungry buzzing of flies. The truck was not untouched. The inside was a slaughterhouse. Gus, or who I assumed was Gus, a large man in a food-stained apron, was still in there, slumped over the grill. A customer, a woman in a jogging outfit, was wedged between the counter and the deep fryer. That was my first time seeing them up close. The shambling, grotesque parodies of people. The memory plague, the news had called it. It seemed apt. Their eyes were vacant, milky white, clouded by cataracts of pure malice. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, every motion a symphony of snapping tendons and grinding bone. There was no intelligence, no flicker of recognition, just a single driving hunger. The one that had been a customer lunged at me as I slid the serving window open. Its jaw unhinged with a wet pop, and a low growl escaped its throat. It was pure instinct, a terrified animal reaction. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy-duty condiment dispenser full of ketchup, and swung it like a club. The sound of it connecting with the creature's skull. It was sickeningly wet, a sound I can still hear in my sleep. It went down, twitching. I didn't stop to think. I vaulted over the counter, my feet slipping in something viscous on the floor. I grabbed everything I could, boxes of stale hot dog buns, shrink-wrapped sausages, bottles of water and soda from a small, now warm refrigerator. On the way back, another one, a woman in a business suit with one arm missing, shambled out from between two cars, drawn by the noise. I didn't hesitate. I threw a bottle of mustard at its head as a distraction and sprinted for the alley hatch, my lungs burning, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I scrambled back into the silent halls, the steel hatch booming shut behind me. I lay there on the cold concrete floor for what felt like an hour, trembling and nauseous, clutching my bounty. Not just stale hot dog buns and lukewarm soda, but a new, chilling purpose. Self-preservation wasn't enough. Surviving day to day felt hollow, meaningless. As I sat in the grand reading room that night, surrounded by the collective knowledge of human history, a profound realization washed over me. These halls held the proof that we existed, that we loved and fought and built and dreamed. The art, the literature, the scientific discoveries, the historical records, they were the memory of our species. The things outside, the memory plague, they were not just killing people, they were erasing them. If I died, if this place was overrun, it would all die with me. All of it would be lost, forgotten. My mission shifted. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was preserving. I found a blank Archivist ledger and a pen, and under the dim light of a single desk lamp began a new collection, the Apocalypse Archive. Journal Entry 1, a first-hand account of the city's fall as witnessed from the windows of the archive. I detailed the timeline, the initial chaos, the military's failed quarantine, the final desperate bombing runs on the bridges that had left them as twisted steel skeletons. I started taking photographs from the roof, a daily record, documenting the city's slow decay, the way nature was already beginning to reclaim it. I used a high-powered parabolic microphone from the audiovisual department to record the sounds of the dead, their moans, their snarls, their strange clicking vocalizations. I began cataloging the chaos, applying the cold, detached methodology of my profession to the end of the world. It was the only way to stay sane. The diesel for the generators wouldn't last forever. By month 3, the fuel gauges were dipping below a quarter full. I had consolidated power, shutting down entire floors, living in a small section of the building that housed my sleeping quarters, the main records, and the security hub. The rest of the archive was plunged into a deep, tomb-like darkness and silence. The physical records, the books, the manuscripts, the artifacts were relatively safe in their climate-controlled vaults, protected. But the sheer inertia of their existence. But the digital records, trillions of terabytes of data, from census records and medical research to the entire digital library of human art, music, and film, were on servers that required constant power and cooling. The server room was a constant low roar, a river of cool air flowing through its circuits. When the generators died, that river would stop. The servers would overheat and die, and with them, a vast portion of human memory would be wiped clean. An unacceptable loss. My search through the archives for a solution led me to a set of municipal planning documents from the 1980s, a project codenamed Persephone. It was a plan to create redundant, secure infrastructure for essential government services in the event of a nuclear war. 10 blocks away was a federal continuity of government data center, a digital Fort Knox built into the bedrock beneath the city. And the schematics, which I found misfiled in a box of zoning disputes, showed we'd a dedicated, shielded underground utility conduit connecting it directly to the archive. It was designed for secure fiber optic cables, but it was 3 feet in diameter, just big enough for a man to crawl through. It was my best and only shot. The preparation took a week of frantic activity. I fashioned a sled from a low-profile library cart, stripping it down to its chassis to drag supplies. I gathered tools, crowbars, wrenches, and every flashlight and battery I could find. My only weapon was a heavy steel fire poker from a decorative fireplace in the director's office, its tip sharpened to a wicked point on a maintenance grinder. The journey through that tunnel was a trip through hell. The air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of mildew, rot, and ozone from the humming cables. The darkness was absolute, a physical pressure on the eyes, broken only by the narrow, bouncing beam of my headlamp. And I was not alone. The conduit, like so many underground spaces, had become a sanctuary. Refuge for the dead. The things that had fled into the subways and sewers during the initial fall had found their way in, drawn to the darkness and the shelter. Their groans and guttural clicks echoed in the suffocating darkness, the acoustics of the pipe making it impossible to pinpoint their location. They were everywhere and nowhere at once. I encountered my first one a half-mile in. It was wedged in the pipe, a city maintenance worker by his uniform, a waterlogged, bloated thing that thrashed weakly as my light fell upon it. There was no room to go around. I had to dispatch it with the fire poker in a sickeningly intimate struggle. The close quarters amplified every sound, every desperate gasp and wet crunch. I continued, my nerves screaming, every scrape of my sled on the concrete sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. I made it to the data center's access point, a heavy steel ladder leading up to a maintenance hatch. The server room itself was not empty. A security breach during the initial fall had allowed dozens of them inside. They wandered aimlessly between the tall, monolithic racks of humming servers, their presence a death sentence for my mission. I couldn't fight them all. I had to use knowledge as a weapon. Retreating to a security monitoring station in an adjacent corridor, I accessed the building's emergency protocols. The system was still active, running on its own independent power grid. I found what I was looking for, the Halon fire suppression system. An old, outdated system, but brutally effective. It worked by displacing oxygen. It wouldn't kill them, they didn't need to breathe, but the sudden, drastic chemical change in the atmosphere should, in theory, cause a massive shock to their primitive nervous systems. It would stun them, incapacitate them for a few crucial minutes. It was a mad gamble based on a half-remembered chemistry lesson. I found a manual trigger, a large red button behind a glass case. I smashed it with the butt of the fire poker, and all hell broke loose. Alarms blared, red lights flashed, and a cold, synthetic voice from the speakers began a 60-second countdown. Warning, Halon system activated. Evacuate area immediately. The sound drew the infected into a frenzy, their moans turning to enraged snarls. I sprinted into the server room, a duffel bag in hand, the countdown echoing in my ears. 50 seconds, 40. I reached the primary server racks for the National Archives. 30. As the countdown hit 10, a loud hissing sound filled the room, and a thick, cold, white gas billowed from nozzles in the ceiling. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The dead stiffened as if electrocuted, their bodies spasming violently. They dropped to the floor, twitching and seizing. I worked frantically, using a specialized tool I'd brought to yank server drives, solid-state blades containing petabytes of data from their racks. I didn't have time to be selective. I grabbed as many as I could carry, stuffing them into my bag, their metal casings cold to the touch. But the stun effect was already wearing off. One of them, a former security guard with its name tag still on, Thompson, began to stir, its limbs jerking. Its head snapped towards me, milky eyes locking onto mine. I didn't wait. I slung the heavy bag over my shoulder and ran, the sound of their snapping teeth just inches behind me as I scrambled back into the conduit, spinning the wheel to seal the heavy hatch behind me. The journey back was a nightmare, burdened by the immense weight of the drives, my body screaming in protest, fueled only by adrenaline and the sheer terror of what was chasing me in the dark. I returned to the safety of the archive, bruised, exhausted, and bleeding from a dozen scrapes, but triumphant. I had the digital soul of a nation in my backpack. The loneliness was a different kind of monster. It was a quiet, creeping thing that gnawed at the edges of my sanity in the long, silent months that followed. The heist. I started talking to myself, narrating my actions in the detached, third-person tone of an academic paper. The subject is now attempting to cultivate mold-resistant potatoes on the rooftop. I held conversations with the portraits of long-dead philanthropists that lined the walls. Cornelius, I'd say to a stern-looking man with mutton-chop whiskers, I'm afraid the structural integrity of the West Wing aqueduct is compromised. After 6 months of absolute solitude, a miracle happened. It came as a faint, crackling voice on the hand-cranked shortwave radio I'd retrieved from the data center. For weeks, I had spent an hour every evening turning the crank, methodically sweeping the frequencies, hearing nothing but static. Then, one night, a voice cut through the hiss. It was weak, distorted, but it was human. A simple, repeated message. Is anyone out there? This is Beacon. We are at the university. We have shelter. Is anyone out there? It took me 3 full days to work up the courage to respond. 3 days of wrestling with the fear that it was a trap, a lure used by desperate, brutal survivors. I had read enough history to know that the monsters outside were not the only kind. But the hope, the desperate, aching need for human contact was a pull too strong to resist. I responded with a cautious, coded message, using old call signs and authentication protocols from a history of espionage exhibit. Beacon, this is Sentinel. What is the color of the boathouse at Hereford? A long pause. Then the voice returned, strained but clear. It's blue, Sentinel. It's blue. We communicated for a week before agreeing to meet. The voice belonged to a physics professor named Elias, a calm, rational man who was as wary as I was. The university was 20 blocks away, a journey that was now a major expedition. I fortified a bookmobile from the archive's garage, reinforcing the windows with steel shelving and welding a crude plow to the front. The drive was surreal, a slow crawl through a dead city, pushing aside the rusted hulks of cars and the shambling forms of the dead. I met them in the fortified courtyard of the university's engineering building. They were a small group, maybe 15 people. Elias, the professor, a young literature student named Sarah, whose fierce eyes belied her small frame. A former campus security guard named Marcus, a mountain of a man who moved with quiet efficiency. Good people, smart people, survivors. But they were forgetting. In the evenings, they would gather around a fire in the courtyard and I would listen. They couldn't remember the name of the first man on the moon. They argued about whether the Second World War came before or after the First. They were losing the context of what humanity had lost. The daily trauma and the relentless struggle for survival were eroding their cultural memory. The past was becoming a vague, dreamlike thing, a collection of half-remembered stories. I became their historian. My mission evolved again. It wasn't enough to preserve the records, I had to disseminate them. I started making trips in the fortified bookmobile, bringing them books from the archive. Not just survival manuals on crop rotation or water purification, but novels, poetry, history. I set up a salvage projector and a laptop powered by a car battery, and in the dark of their makeshift mess hall, I showed them the digital photos and videos from the drives I'd salvaged. I showed them images of a world they were starting to think was just a dream. Bustling cities, children playing in parks, a full orchestra playing Beethoven's Ninth, footage from the Mars rover. I told them stories, not just of kings and wars, but of art, science, and discovery. I explained the principles of democracy using the original Federalist Papers, their elegant script projected onto a stained concrete wall. I read them Shakespeare by candlelight, the words of Hamlet echoing in the ruins of a lecture hall. I was giving them back their past, their history, their identity. And in doing so, I was giving them a reason to fight for a future. For the first time in months, I saw genuine hope in their eyes, a spark of the civilization we had lost. But I also learned that knowledge can be a dangerous thing. Word of our growing community, our library trips, and the fortress of resources I commanded began to spread on the radio waves. We weren't the only ones listening, and our small flame of hope had made us a target. A larger, more brutal group of survivors learned about my fortress of knowledge. They were led by a man they called the Colonel, a former National Guard officer who had gathered a small army of desperate, violent people under his command. They had military discipline, scavenged equipment, and a philosophy carved from the harshest realities of the New World. Might makes right. They saw the archive not as a sanctuary of history, but as a tactical asset, high ground, thick walls, and a source of supply. They believed was theirs for the taking. They sent an envoy first, the colonel himself, with 2 of his men. They met us on the street halfway between our 2 locations. He was a tall man, gaunt but hard, his eyes holding the flat, dead look of someone who had seen too much and done worse. He offered me a place in his new order. My friends from the university would be put to work. The books, the art, the records, they would be fuel for the fires. "We're building a new world, Archivist," he'd said, his voice full of gravel and contempt. "A practical world, a strong world. It has no room for your dusty old stories and fairy tales about democracy and art. History is a burden. We're starting clean." I looked at Elias and Sarah standing beside me, their faces pale but resolute. I thought of the children I'd read stories to. I refused. His smile was thin and cruel. Wrong answer. That was when the siege began. They were smart. They didn't launch a frontal assault against the granite walls. That would have been suicide. They used the horde as a weapon. For days, they used loud noises, gunshots, explosives scavenged from a construction site, rigging car alarms to go off in sequence to draw thousands of the dead from all over the city and herd them towards the archive. Soon, the building was an island in a sea of groaning, grasping bodies, a tide of death beating against our walls. My new friends from the university came to help, abandoning their own shelter to make a stand with me, bringing their courage and their skills. We became a community forged in fire. Elias, the professor, used his knowledge of physics to help me rig electrical defenses from the generator's output, running wires to the steel shutters. Sarah, the student, organized our meager medical supplies with triage efficiency. Marcus, the guard, trained us in basic combat, how to hold a line, how to fight back to back. But we were barely 20 people against 100 of the colonel's fighters and an idea of thousands of the dead. The siege lasted a month, a relentless, soul-crushing grind of fear and exhaustion. Sleep came in stolen minutes. Food and water were strictly rationed. The noise was constant, a hellish symphony of groans from the dead and taunts from the living. We used every bit of my archival knowledge to survive. I pulled architectural plans of 19th century prisons, using their designs for crowd control and defense to fortify our corridors with a series of choke points and fallback positions. We funneled the dead that managed to get through the outer perimeter into the reinforced, fireproof archival vaults in the sub-basement and sealed them in, entombing hundreds at a time. We created choke points in the stacks based on diagrams of ancient Greek phalanx formations I had memorized from a historical text, using rows of heavy steel map cases as shields. We used the building's pneumatic tube system, once used for requesting books, to send messages, ammunition, and medical supplies between defended positions. But they were relentless. On the 28th day, they used a construction vehicle, a massive front-end loader, to ram a loading bay door, creating a breach. The fighting moved inside, a desperate, close-quarters battle through the labyrinthine shelves of the history section. The smell of gunpowder and blood mingled with the dry, sweet scent of old paper. The final assault came in the main reading room, a vast 3-story hall. They had us cornered. We were out of ammunition, exhausted, and outnumbered 3-1. The colonel himself led the charge, a savage grin on his face. That was when I was faced with a terrible choice. Let them take this sanctuary, this last bastion of human memory, or use the most flammable, most precious items I had sworn my life to protect to create a firebreak and drive them back. "We can't!" Sarah screamed, seeing me look towards the preservation lab. "Arthur, that's everything! That's the Magna Carta facsimile, the correspondence!" "Shakespeare folios!" I looked at the determined faces of my friends, bleeding and exhausted but still fighting. I looked at the snarling, hate-filled faces of the Colonel's men who wanted to burn it all anyway. I made my decision. "History is a living thing, Sarah," I yelled over the din. "It's not in the objects, it's in us. We have to live for it to matter." With a heavy heart, I gave the order. We doused priceless artifacts and alcohol from the preservation labs. We threw original manuscripts from the 16th century, rolled up canvases from master painters, and stacks of irreplaceable photographs onto a pile in the center of the room. We chose to save the future over the past. We set it ablaze. The fire was immense, a roaring inferno that filled the grand hall with thick black smoke. It devoured 1,000 years of history in 10 minutes. The heat drove the attackers back, creating a wall of flame between us. It gave us the chance we needed to regroup, to counterattack through the smoke and chaos, using the fire as our shield and our weapon. We burned history to protect it. We won. In the chaos of the fire, we managed to push them back, to use the inferno to funnel them into a dead end where we sealed a final door. The Colonel, blinded by his own arrogance and rage, was caught under a section of the burning ceiling that collapsed. We heard his screams over the roar of the flames. His forces, leaderless and broken, scattered into the night, harried by the very dead they had so eagerly manipulated. The archive stands. It is scarred, blackened, and wounded, but it is secure. But the victory came at a terrible cost. We lost people, good people. Marcus, the stoic security guard, fell defending the breach so the rest of us could retreat to the reading room. 3 others from the university gave their lives, fighting among the shelves of knowledge they had come to defend. We buried them in the courtyard, marking their graves with stones from the damaged facade of the building. Elias said a few words, not from any religious text, but from Carl Sagan's Cosmos, and we each threw a handful of soil onto their simple graves. Today marks 1 year since the world ended and a new one began. The air outside still smells of ash and decay, but for the first time, it also smells a little like wood smoke from the hopeful new settlement we are building within these walls. The great reading room is a blackened, cavernous shell, a monument to our sacrifice. We left it as it is, a reminder of the price of survival. But the rest of the building is alive. The server drives are rescued are our new library of Alexandria. Elias and his team has scavenged parts from all over the city and are working to build a small, self-contained network, a repository of knowledge for a new generation. They call it the Loom. The books we protected are our new Rosetta Stone, the key to understanding who we were and who we can be again. Sarah has started a school for the handful of children. Dren we found in the months since the siege, using primers and history books to teach them a world they will never see. I watch them sometimes, learning to read from books that have survived centuries, and I feel a sense of hope that is fierce and defiant. My job is no longer just to preserve the past. It's to use that past to build a future, to curate the knowledge that is most essential for survival, for rebuilding, for remembering what it means to be human. My hands are calloused and stained, not with archival ink, but with grit, gunpowder, and the soil from our rooftop garden where we now grow our own food. This journal is no longer an obituary for a dead world. It is a blueprint for a new one. It's a record, not of what was lost, but of what we are determined to rebuild. The first volume is now full. Tomorrow, I will begin the second. This is entry 365. The work continues.